back in time over 2,000 years to the year 300 BC. It's around that time that the practice that we now know as alchemy first got its start. And if we think of alchemists today, we probably picture strange old men trying to turn lead into gold. And indeed, that was one of the goals of the alchemists. Today in 2013, we can look back at what they were doing and we can see it as silly and foolish, but in its time, it was taken very seriously. There were schools you could go to learn alchemy, the government licensed alchemists, and so on and so forth. So alchemy was around for about 2,000 years until the 1700s and 1800s, at which point it was replaced by chemistry. You may have noticed that the names alchemy and chemistry have a little something in common. And whereas alchemy was basically a 2,000-year exercise in futility that accomplished almost nothing of value for humankind, chemistry in just the past few hundred years has achieved all sorts of things that have improved and extended the life of human beings. So whether things like life-saving medication or even things that are just more personally enjoyable like smartphones or fresh drinking water coming out of our tap. So chemistry is responsible, at least in part, for bringing about all of those things that have improved and extended our life. So if we think about alchemy and we think about chemistry, why did one succeed where the other failed? Why did alchemy achieve almost nothing of value? Why has chemistry been so successful? What is the difference between the two? And perhaps most importantly of all, why am I talking about chemistry and alchemy at an animal rights event? Well, the difference between the two is a very simple one, but it's also a very fundamental one. And that is, the difference is the scientific method. So chemists did use and do use the scientific method. Alchemists did not use the scientific method. Now, for those of us who don't remember exactly what the scientific method is all about, it's basically all about testing. So if we want to assert that something is true, we better be able to do, or at least be able to point to, the testing and research that shows that it is in fact true if we were going to claim that it's true. Now, testing is really the heart of science. If we look up the definition of the word science on Wikipedia, we'll see in the very first sentence that science builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions. So it's testing and research which has really helped science advance step by step. It helps chemistry advance step by step out of the murky depths of alchemy, and it's what helps any discipline, any pursuit, advance to greater understanding and greater effectiveness. It's probably easy for us to understand the importance of testing and research in those hard sciences, so things like chemistry or biology or physics. But testing is actually being used in all corners of our society right now. So to give you a few examples, here in the US, where I am, our president, Barack Obama, was reelected last year, reelected president of the US, despite the fact that the American economy was in one of the worst states it had been in over 70 years. And one of the things the media pointed to as the reason that he was able to win re-election was his campaign's use of research and testing. He hired a team of 50 data analysts who did nothing but use research and testing to figure out which American voters were undecided about which presidential candidate to vote for, and to figure out what messages would be most likely to get them to vote for Obama. That campaign effort, that money, that time that they put into testing paid off. Barack Obama won re-election. So that's politics, but let's look at business as well. Businesses spend tens of billions of dollars every year on market research and testing to figure out how to do a more effective job at what it is they're trying to accomplish, which is, of course, to sell as many products as they can. So they put all this time, they put all this money into the market research, into testing, to figure out things like what products to sell, what features to include, who to target their advertising to, and so on and so forth. And they do all this testing and research because it works. It helps them sell more products. It helps them make more money. So that's politics, that's business. But what about the nonprofit world? Testing and research are starting to be used in the nonprofit world as well to help nonprofits do a better job at whatever it is they're trying to achieve. So, for example, one very pressing human health issue is the spread of malaria, a disease which still kills about 5 million people every year. So there's some organizations that are working to fight malaria in Africa, and one of the things they do is they distribute insecticide-treated bed nets that people can wrap around them while they're sleeping. The reason for this is one of the main ways malaria is transmitted is mosquitoes who carry the disease will prick people while they're sleeping, pass into their bloodstream, and they get malaria. So these bed nets can keep the mosquitoes away and therefore keep the malaria away. So that was all well and good. But the nonprofits doing this work, distributing these bed nets, they had a bit of a question, and that was this. Some of the nonprofits felt that just giving the nets away for free was the best thing to do, because that way everyone would have a net, more people would use it, and it would be most effective for stopping the spread of malaria. But other organizations thought differently. They felt that the better thing to do was to charge a small price for the nets, maybe 50 cents, like a very small amount of money, something that basically everyone could afford, but that once they had paid even a little bit towards it, they would now be, in a way, personally invested in it and more likely to actually make use of the nets. So some organizations thought one way was more effective, some thought the other was more effective. And no one really knew which was the case. So some researchers came in and they decided, let's just do some research and testing and find out the actual answer. So they tried one method in one area, they tried another method in another similar area, and they found out that it was giving the nets away for free that was more effective at stopping the spread of malaria. So simply by inserting a little bit of science, a little bit of testing into the good work they were already doing, these anti-malaria organizations are now able to save even more lives for the same amount of time, the same amount of money. Now, that's the nonprofit field when it comes to helping human health and saving human lives. And we're not exactly here this weekend to talk about helping humankind, but we are here to talk about helping animals and helping to protect them from cruelty, to advance the world that we want to see in terms of protecting animals. So now the question is, can the same type of research and testing that's used in business, in politics, and elsewhere in the nonprofit field, can they the same approach? And can those same tools be used by us animal advocates to be more effective at the work that we are doing? Well, if we think about the plight of animals, if we think about the plight that they're going through, and if we think about the work that any of us as individuals or that any of our organizations are doing to try to help animals, pretty much everything we're trying to achieve comes down to, if we want to succeed, success comes down to one simple thing, and that is changing human behavior. So whether that's getting individual members of the public to go vegetarian or go vegan, whether it's getting the heads of companies to adopt more animal-friendly policies, whether it's getting politicians to vote in support of animal-friendly legislation, every one of these changes requires changing human beliefs, and most importantly, changing human behaviors. Now, when it comes to changing human behaviors and bringing about a more compassionate world for animals, there's some things that we as animal advocates sometimes tell ourselves that sound good, that feel good, but that aren't necessarily true. For example, sometimes we tell ourselves that we as a movement will succeed because we're on the side of compassion. There's a quote here in the US that's often repeated from the civil rights campaigner Martin Luther King, in which he stated that the arc of the moral universe is long, but ultimately it bends towards justice. Those are very comforting, very inspiring words. Sometimes we tell ourselves our movement will succeed because we really, really care about animals, or will succeed if we just work very hard. Now, every one of these things are going to help us succeed. Being on the compassionate side, really caring, working hard, all of those will help us succeed. But if we look back through history, and if we look around the world today, we see that, unfortunately, far too often, those who are on the side of justice, those who are on the side of compassion, those who cared a lot, those who worked very hard, did not succeed. They failed, or they are failing. So all those things will help us succeed. They alone will not guarantee that we will succeed at bringing about the world we want to see for animals. So I think that we'll succeed at changing behavior and helping animals if we take the time to learn what really motivates people to change their beliefs and to change their behaviors. And so psychology research can really be a roadmap of how to bring about these changes in behavior, both beliefs and actual behavior. And just as we wouldn't get into a car and drive to a new city we've never been to before without first stopping to get the directions of how to get from point A to point B, it would also be a bit presumptuous of us as animal advocates to think that we know how to steer members of the public from attitude A to attitude B, or behavior A, omnivore, to behavior B, vegan, without us first learning the directions of how to steer people in that more compassionate direction. So I think that we, as the animal advocacy movement, we really have two choices. So like the alchemists, just as the alchemists believed and asserted that they could turn lead into gold, even though there was no scientific evidence showing that to be correct, we can assume, we animal advocates can assume, that we know the best messages and the best approaches for getting people to go vegan or otherwise care about animals. Or, like the chemists, we can insert the scientific method and research and testing into the good work we are already doing to become even more effective for animals. And one of the reasons I think that latter approach is so important is that our assumptions about what motivate people to change their beliefs and change their behavior, those assumptions are often incorrect. And I want to give you one example of that from the research. I'm going to be citing a number of different studies this afternoon. Some come directly from the field of animal protection, some come from other fields, but they're all useful and instructive to the work that we are doing as animal advocates. So, in this one particular study, researchers wanted to see what is the best way for getting homeowners to reduce the amount of energy they are using in their homes. So, they created 4 different brochures, each of which spoke about one reason to conserve energy. So one booklet spoke about the environmental reasons to conserve. One spoke about the financial savings you could get by conserving energy. One booklet spoke about the benefits to the community. And one simply said that most people in that town were already conserving energy. So researchers then went around to homes in one particular neighborhood and knocked on doors, and they left just one booklet at each house. They then worked with a local utility company to monitor the actual energy usage in these homes over the next 3 months. And what they found is that of all 4 of these booklets, there's only one that actually got people to reduce the amount of energy they were using. And that one was the 4th one, the one that simply said that most people in that town were conserving energy. The booklet that spoke about the environmental reasons, the booklet that spoke about the financial reasons. Neither of those were effective at getting people to actually reduce their own energy usage. Now, if I was an environmental campaigner there in Australia and I wanted homeowners to reduce the amount of energy they were using, chances are I would use an environmental message because, after all, I am an environmental campaigner. Or maybe I would use that financial message, try to appeal to people's financial self-interest. The point here is that our assumptions about what works for motivating people to change their behaviors, and as we'll see later, their beliefs as well, those assumptions are often incorrect, which is why when it comes to the practical, day-to-day decisions that we make as animal advocates, it's important to look not to philosophy, not to guesses, and not to assumptions to guide those practical decisions. Rather, we should just look to what works, what actually works, and what doesn't work for changing human beliefs and for changing human behaviors in a more animal-friendly direction. Now, thankfully for all of us as animal advocates, if we went to our local university library, we could find thousands and thousands and thousands of peer-reviewed academic studies showing what works and what doesn't for changing beliefs and behaviors. Now, probably reading through thousands of academic studies doesn't exactly sound like a fun time to many of us, so I've tried to do as much of this research as possible and compile it into 2 books, one of which came out a few years ago, and it's called Change of Hearts, What Psychology Can Teach Us About Spreading Social Change. And that looks at all the general research on, again, what works and what doesn't for changing beliefs and behaviors. I also have a new book that's just kind of in the process of coming out now called Veganomics, which looks at the hundreds of studies that have been done on vegetarians and vegans themselves, that research specific to them. And so what I'm going to do with the rest of my time this afternoon is I'm going to share with you what I consider to be some of the most important points from this research. And by most important, I mean the tools, practical tools that we can use in our own lives, in our own advocacy, to be more effective advocates for animals. And most of the things I'm going to talk about, I'm going to frame these tools in terms of promoting vegan eating. But you could really apply these tools to basically any other type of animal advocacy work that you happen to be doing. All right, so let's get right into it. So first I want to share some tools, some of these practical tools that we can use to be more effective. And the first is stories versus statistics. So if we're talking to a friend, a family member, a member of the public about factory farming and vegan eating, what is going to be a more effective approach? Is it better to tell them the story about an individual animal and what life is like for them on a factory farm? Is it better to give statistics about how big the problem of animal use and abuse is and the hundreds of millions and billions of animals killed each year for meat? Or is it better to do both of these, have both the story and the statistics showing how big the problem is? Well, some researchers wanted to try to find out the answer to this. And now, they were not animal activists, but they looked at another very serious issue, and that is the issue of starvation in Africa. And so what they did is they created 3 fundraising letters. The first one spoke about how big the problem was. So it spoke about the tens of millions of people that starve to death each year. It spoke about the number of people displaced by war and famine and so forth. The second letter didn't have any of that. It just had the story of one young African girl and what life was like for her on a day-to-day basis as a child facing starvation. And the third letter had both. So it had the statistics about how big the problem was, but it also had the story of that young girl. So 3 different fundraising letters. They all were sent out. The donations came back in. And at the end of the day, one of those letters did twice as good, raised twice as much money, did twice as much to put food in the mouths of hungry people as either of the other 2 letters. And it turned out that the most effective letter was the second one, the one that had only the story. In fact, the letter with only the story did about, again, twice as good as the letter with just the statistics, and twice as good as the letter that had both the story and the statistics. Now, if we human beings were logical creatures, hearing that tens of millions of people are starving should make us donate more money than hearing that one young girl is starving. But we obviously are not always the most logical, rational animals, and this is certainly one example of that. For some reason, what researchers have found in both this and other studies is that when people think analytically, when most people think analytically and in terms of numbers, they actually become less compassionate, less likely to make compassionate changes in their behavior and in their life. The other thing the study shows us is that, again, stories, on the other hand, are very powerful. They have emotional power over our behavior, beliefs, and they can drive us towards more compassionate decisions. One other quick example of the power of stories. There was a university professor who wanted his class to design and give presentations about a topic of their own choice. So he had all the students do that one day in class, and after the class was over, he polled the students to see what they remembered of one another's talks that day. And what he found is that of the facts and figures and statistics given that day by the students, only about 5% were remembered by the other students in the class. But of the stories given that day, a full 60% were remembered by the rest of the students. So not only are stories emotionally powerful, they're also inherently sticky. They stick in our mind, and they have the power to influence us and our behavior on an ongoing basis. So what does this mean for us as animal advocates when it comes to promoting vegan eating? Well, because we know how big the problem is and how many farm animals suffer, we're often tempted to talk about how big the problem is. Again, what this research suggests is that we'll be more effective at getting people to care and getting them to make the changes we would like them to make by telling stories of individual farm animals and what life is like for them on a day-to-day basis on one of these factory farms. Okay, moving on, the best request. So, let me put a hypothetical situation in front of you. Let's say that tomorrow I was going into an average high school university class there in Australia, and I was going to talk to this average class of students about factory farming, vegan eating, diet change, the ethics of what we eat, and so forth. At the end of the class, what request should I make of my audience? What should I encourage them to do? Now, if I was encouraging them to do everything that I wanted them to do and what I thought the ethical thing to do would be, I would encourage them all to certainly go vegan. I would encourage them all to become full-time animal rights activists. I would encourage them all to donate every spare dollar they had to animal advocacy, to only eat organic food, to not drive a car, to not have kids, and on and on and on, right? Because I think that all those things would be commendable ethical choices to make. But probably if I encouraged all of them to do all these things, they would just look at me like I was crazy and they wouldn't do anything at all. So I could make that big request. I could ask for exactly what I want. Or maybe I could make a small request instead, encourage people to make a small change that would be pretty easy for most people to do. Or maybe I could make something in the middle. So I have basically a range of requests I could make of my audience. And so the question for us as animal advocates, whether we're speaking to a crowd or whether we're just speaking to a friend or someone we meet on the street, the question is, what is the best request that we can make? What is the request that's going to bring about the greatest amount of behavior change? Well, some researchers wanted to put this to the test. And so they've done a number of studies to try to find out what is the most effective request to make. And what they found is that the request that creates the most behavior change is this. It's encouraging people to make a change that is significant so that they could probably picture themselves doing. If they can't picture themselves doing it, it's probably too large of a change, and probably very few people will actually make that change. On the other hand, if it's a very small request, something very easy to do, yes, maybe lots and lots of people will do it. But because it is a small change, you haven't accomplished an overall huge amount of behavior change, an overall huge amount of good in the world. Now, what does all this mean when it comes to promoting vegan eating? Well, if we look at studies from both the U.S. and the rest of the Western world, such as Australia, we see that the vast majority of the public sees vegan eating as unhealthy and overly restrictive. There's still large percentages of the population that also see vegetarian eating as overly restrictive and potentially unhealthy. Here in the U.S., where vegan eating is certainly becoming more common and more accepted, there was a study done this year in 2013 that found that even over 50% of vegetarians think that veganism is unhealthy and overly restrictive. So clearly the vast majority of the general public cannot picture themselves right now going vegan. On the other hand, probably virtually everyone could picture themselves eating less meat and seeing that as a doable and healthy thing to do. And perhaps for some segments of the population, especially young people like college students, a larger percentage of them could maybe see themselves as being vegetarian. So my assumption, my guess based on this research and based on these surveys, is that the request that's going to create the most diet change and therefore spare the greatest number of animals is probably a request in the range of eating less meat to going vegetarian. That's probably that range of requests that is a request that is significant, that people could see themselves doing, and that therefore is going to create the most diet change and spare the greatest number of animals. One other thing to keep in mind when we think about what diet changes we encourage other people to make is this. Not all farm animals suffer in equal amounts for the average meat eater. So I put together a little chart, which unfortunately I can't share with you today because we don't have PowerPoint, but I'll describe it for you. So basically I was trying to figure out, how many days of farm animal suffering does the average meat eater cost? So for example, in the U.S., if the average meat eater eats 30 chickens a year, and the average chicken lives for about 40 days, then the average meat eater is causing 30 times 40 equals 1,200 days of chicken suffering each year. And of course, they're also causing many days of suffering for pigs, for farm-raised fish, for beef cows, dairy cows, laying hens, and so forth. And so I wanted to see where is most of this suffering concentrated. And if we add it up, the number of days of farm animal suffering that the average meat eater causes, we'll see that over 95% of the suffering that they cause are caused to chickens, whether chickens raised from meat or eggs, and to farm-raised fish. Now, this data is specific to the U.S., but the general ratios absolutely apply there in Australia as well. Nearly all of the days of suffering that the average meat eater causes are caused to chickens or to farm-raised fish. And if we look at the number of animals killed, we see the same. Over 95% of the number of animals killed are fish or chickens. Now, this isn't because people are sitting down at every meal and eating chicken and fish at every single meal. It's simply a function of the fact that chicken and fish are small. They weigh a few pounds. And so people don't get many meals out of each chicken or each fish, whereas pigs or cows are huge, and so they can get many more meals out of them. So, what does this mean for us as animal advocates? Well, if we're talking to someone else, a friend, a family member of the public, and they're not willing to go vegan and they're not willing to go vegetarian, but maybe they are willing to make to make some change in the right direction, then maybe the best first step we can encourage them to take is to simply cut out or cut back on chicken, or maybe chicken and farm-raised fish. As a first step in the right direction, that's a step that would reduce a huge amount of suffering and spare a huge number of animals from a lifetime of misery. Just by getting one of our friends, family members, a member of the public to cut out chicken and farm-raised fish, will reduce by 95% the number of animals they are killing and the amount of suffering that they are causing with their diet. Of course, that's not all we want, but that's a great first step in the right direction, a very big first step. Okay, moving on. So the next tool I want to talk about is called Foot in the Door. And I want to give you an example from the research that will make pretty clear what Foot in the Door is all about. So there were some researchers who wanted to promote safe driving in one particular town. And so what they did is they went around and they knocked on doors and they asked people, homeowners, to put up these rather ugly yard signs, these bright yellow yard signs that said drive safely. They asked homeowners to put these yard signs out in their front yard. Now, because the yard signs are not all that attractive, only about 20% of homeowners agreed to and did put the yard signs out in their front yard. Researchers then went around to other homes in the same neighborhood, but this time they brought with them little 3-inch by 3-inch window stickers that also said, please drive safely. Knocked on doors, said, hi, we're promoting safe driving. We wondered if you would put up this window sticker. And because it was such an easy thing to do, to stick that little window sticker up in your window, virtually everyone agreed to and did put up these stickers. 3 weeks later, researchers went back to the same homes that had gotten the stickers. But this time they brought with them the rather ugly yard signs. So knocked on doors, said, hi, thanks so much for putting up that sticker. And now we wondered if you would put this yard sign out in your front yard. And this time, not 20%, but a full 70% agreed to and did put the yard signs out in their front yard. So even though the main goal of the researchers was to get homeowners to put these yard signs out in their front yard, they were much more effective at doing so by first making a similar but smaller request that people were likely to say yes to, waiting for a little time to pass, and then going back and making their second, real, larger request. There are literally over 1,000 studies documenting the power of this foot-in-the-door approach. And I want to give you just 2 other very quick examples. Another study found that people who were asked to sign a petition to support the building of a recreation center for the physically handicapped, the next week donated twice as much money to support that building as those who were never even asked to sign the petition. Similarly, people who were asked to wear a little pin promoting the Canadian Cancer Society, the next week donated twice as much money to support that organization as those who were never even asked to wear a pin in the first place. Now, why would this work? Why would signing a petition or putting on a pin or putting up a window sticker make us much more likely to make a more significant contribution of our time or energy or money down the line? Well, the reason that researchers think that foot in the door is so powerful is that it influences our sense of self-identity. So if someone asked me to wear that little Canadian Cancer Society pin, I may never have thought about cancer at all. I may not have any relatives who have suffered from it. I may not care about it much at all. But I know the polite thing to do is to put on that pin. And once I put on that pin, I start to think of myself as, I guess I'm the sort of person who cares about fighting cancer. Otherwise, why would I be wearing this little pin? And so it starts to shift our sense of self-identity of how we see ourselves. So when someone then comes back and asks us to donate or volunteer or contribute in some other way to fight cancer, we are much more likely to say yes, because it's consistent with how we see ourselves. So what does all this mean when it comes to us as animal advocates, and specifically as advocates of vegan eating? Well, there are some vegan advocates who have the belief that we should always and only promote veganism, right? And their reason is, their concern is a very understandable one. It's that if we encourage the public to do anything less than go vegan, like if we encourage them to cut out meat on Monday or to go vegetarian or something like that, then yes, people may make those changes. They may eat less meat, they may go vegetarian, but they'll become complacent. They'll think that's enough, they'll stop there, and they won't ultimately go on to do what we would like them to do, which is, of course, to go vegan. It's a very understandable concern. But thankfully, if we look to foot-in-the-door research and related research, we see that thankfully we don't have to have that worry. People who make a small change in one direction become more likely to make larger changes in that direction down the line. So people who go meatless on Monday become more likely to go vegan. People who go vegetarian become more likely to go vegan. We can actually see this when we look to surveys of current vegetarians and current meat reducers. Surveys both in the US and in Europe have shown that those who say they've started cutting back on the amount of meat they're eating are much more likely to have a desire, an intention to go vegetarian compared to the general public. And those who have gone vegetarian have a much higher desire and intention to go vegan compared to the general public. So each step someone takes down this road of eating less meat and less meat and less meat, they become more likely to take similar larger changes down the line. So when we can combine this with what we were talking about earlier with the best request, it seems that ironically, the way to create the most vegans in society is probably not through spending most of our time promoting veganism specifically. Rather, it seems that we'll create the most diet changes and help the most animals in the short term, and also create the most vegans in the long term by encouraging people to do something between eat less meat and go vegetarian. Okay, moving on. I want to talk about social norms. We all like to think of ourselves as these very independent-minded people who make the decisions we make because we've thought about them and we've decided, this is who I am, this is what I believe, and this is how I'm going to live my life. But the reality is that we're all very influenced by what other people are doing. We saw that earlier in the study on home energy usage, and I want to give you just one other example from the research. So in this study, there was a hotel that wanted their guests to start reusing bath towels. Now, their main motivation was financial. If people wanted a fresh bath towel every night, that would mean more laundry to do. So more water, more electricity, more staff to do the laundry, and so on and so forth. But the hotel also knew that if people reused their towels, it would be good for the environment, of course. Less water, less electricity. So they put up these little signs in every room in the hotel that said, in order to help us protect the environment, we encourage you to please reuse your bath towels. And you know what? The signs did work. Some people did start reusing their towels. But researchers came in and they thought they could do a bit of a better job. So they took out all the old signs and they put in news in every room that had just one sentence on it. And that was, most guests in this hotel reuse their bath towels. And switching from that environmental to the social norms message increased towel reuse by about 25%. And when the signs were made even more specific, so they said most guests in room 309 or whatever room it was reused the bath towels, boom, towel reuse increased even further still. So what does this mean for us as advocates of, again, vegan eating? Well, of course we want to talk about the cruelty done to farm animals. Of course we want to talk about the health benefits of vegan eating. What the research suggests is that if we also add in a social norms message, we'll be more effective at getting people to listen, to care, and to change. So we can talk about the growing number of vegetarians and vegans and meat reducers. We can talk about the growing availability of vegan food in restaurants and grocery stores. We can point out celebrities and athletes and politicians who are vegetarian, who are vegan. The more we do these things, the more we make it look like vegan and vegetarian eating are a large and growing trend, the more effective we'll be at, again, getting other people to take it seriously, to consider making these changes, and to make these changes themselves. Lastly, the last tool I want to talk about, and that is showing people how. Because we know all the problems of animal agriculture, we spend so much time telling people why they should change their diet. So why it's good for animals, why it's good for the environment, why it's good for health, why it's good for social justice. Why? We don't spend nearly enough time showing people how to make these changes that we would like them to make. And I think one of the reasons for that is that when we've been doing something for a long time, it starts to seem easy to us. And we forget that those things that now seem easy to us can seem almost impossible to someone who has never done these things before. So while, of course, we need to leave people wanting to go vegan or move towards being vegan, we also need to leave them feeling like they know how to do it, like they know how to ditch meat and other animal products. There was a really important study that came out a few years ago that found that this study was called a meta-analysis, and that it looked at over 200 studies on behavior change. And what it wanted to find is, what is the best predictor of whether or not someone will actually change their behavior? Now, not surprisingly, the study found that attitude mattered. People who wanted to make a change in a certain direction were more likely to do it. No surprise there. But what was surprising is that attitude was not the biggest predictor of whether or not people actually changed their behavior. The biggest predictor was whether or not people felt they had the ability to make that behavior change. So again, it's important for us to make people want to go vegan, but it's just as, and possibly slightly more important, for us to focus on showing people how to make these changes, leaving them feeling like they know how to ditch meat and other animal products. And if we look to the research about why people don't go vegetarian, why current vegetarians and vegans go back to eating meat, we see that there are four main barriers that people talk about, four main barriers that prevent them from cutting meat out of the diet or keeping meat out of the diet. So what are those four main how barriers that we as animal advocates need to address with the public? So the first and biggest is taste. And people worry that vegan food doesn't taste good, they don't want to give up the foods and flavors they know and love, so taste is the biggest concern that people have. Second is health. Many people are starting to realize vegan and vegetarian eating is healthy, but there's still a high percentage of people that think it is unhealthy or potentially unhealthy. And the biggest health concern that people have, especially young people, is where to get enough protein as a vegetarian or vegan, a question that probably many of us have heard before. Third biggest how barrier is convenience. People feel like they don't know where to buy vegan food, how to prepare it, and so forth. And fourthly and finally are social concerns. People worry that if they are the only vegetarian in their group of friends, that it will just be kind of awkward if they go out to eat and there may be nothing for them to eat, and so on and so forth. So if we want to move more people to being vegetarian, to being vegan, we need to show them how to address each of these how barriers. We need to make sure we show them how to find really delicious vegan food, maybe how to prepare a few simple things. We need to give them a couple basic tips about how to be healthy as a vegetarian or a vegan. And we need to give them some simple advice on navigating those sometimes awkward social situations when eating out or in other food-based social situations with omnivores. The more we address these how barriers, the more likely we'll be to get people to go vegetarian and go vegan. But this is also important for keeping those who are already vegetarian and vegan to continue to eat with a more compassionate diet. And this is important because the unfortunate reality is that for every 4 people who say they are vegetarian right now, at least 3 of them will eventually go back to eating meat. At least 3 out of 4 vegetarians eventually go back to eating meat. And so the more we address these health barriers, the more likely we will be to help these people stay vegetarian, stay vegan. Now, I'm getting close to being done, but before I finish, I want to talk for a few minutes about our own psychology and about how our own psychology can either help or hurt our efforts at bringing about that world we want to see for animals. It can sometimes be difficult to face ourselves and to face our motivation for doing the work that we do as animal advocates. So I'm sure that all of you there today and me sitting here, I'm sure the main motivation that each of us has is that we know animals are suffering, we care about animals, and we want to stop that suffering, that injustice, that cruelty, that killing. So we have that altruistic motivation. But we probably also all have personal motivations for being here this weekend and for doing the sort of work that we do. For example, we may have the motivation of wanting to express ourselves and what we believe. It's a very natural human tendency to want to let the world know what we think and what we feel about issues that are important to us. We may also have the motivation of wanting to have fun, go to events that are entertaining or informative, be around other people who are friendly with us, things like that. And lastly, probably all of us also have the motivation of wanting to feel good, feel like our lives have a little bit of added meaning because we're working to make the world a better place. Now, all of these personal motivations are well and good. They're a natural part of being a happy, healthy human being. But we have to realize that sometimes our desire to do what works for animals and to do what helps the most animals can conflict with some of these more personal motivations that we also have. So I want to give you a couple examples of that. So one is in terms of appearance. I'm speaking here to you today, but if I was speaking to you 10 years ago, I would look a little different. I would have dreadlocks, I'd have a beard, I would have pretty dirty clothing that I gotten from the thrift store, and that was just kind of my style back then. And it would be great if we lived in a world where people did not judge one another by appearance. But we all know that if we think back to that hypothetical situation where I'm going in tomorrow to talk to an average class of high school or university students, we all know that if the me today that looks normal versus the me 10 years ago with the dreadlocks and the beard and so forth, that if those two me's went and spoke in front of those high school university classes, we all know that the me today, the me who looks more normal, would be more effective at getting students to listen, to take the issue seriously, and to actually make changes. Our own experience and the research show that people do judge one another very much based on appearance. Studies have shown that time and time again. And while, of course, in our own life, we don't want to judge other people by their appearance, it's a simple and unavoidable fact that having one appearance versus another can mean the difference of saving hundreds, if not thousands, of additional animals from a lifetime of misery and killing. That literally is what the difference of one appearance versus another can have if we are active animal advocates. And for me, it was very hard. It took years to change my appearance. and adopt a more mainstream appearance in order to be a more effective animal advocate. But one thing that I kept in mind that helped me make this switch was realizing, if it was my mom who was going to be killed, like one of these animals are killed, and I knew that having one appearance versus another would increase the likelihood I could save my mom's life by 20%, 30%, 40%. Of course, I would change my appearance. I would have the appearance most likely to save my mom's life. And so if I would do that to help one person, then certainly I should do the same if it can save the lives of hundreds, thousands of additional individuals. So moving on, one of the ways where our personal motivations can conflict with our more altruistic motivations are in our interactions with other people. So let's say I am taking the advice from some of the speakers of yesterday, and I'm going out and I'm doing some vegan leafleting at a college or university campus near me. And someone stops and they want to talk to me, and they're not vegetarian or vegan, but they're willing to have a conversation. What is going on in the back of my mind as I start to talk to this person? Am I thinking I need to tell this person about the billions of animals killed each year for food, and about how pigs are confined in cages so small they can't turn around, and male chicks are ground up alive by the egg industry, and that if you care about the environment and fighting climate change, then you have to go vegan. It's the best thing to do. And by the way, if you go vegan, you'll live 5 years longer, and on and on and on. Or, in the back of my mind, am I thinking, who is this person in front of me? And what can I say, and how can I say it, that's going to be most likely to get them to do what I would like them to do, which is change their diet in a direction that helps animals. Those are two fundamentally different approaches. The first is focused on expressing what I know, what I believe, and what I want. And the second starts with the end goal in mind, behavior change, in the other person, and it works backward from there. And of course, it's that latter approach that's going to be much more effective at getting people to listen, to care, and to change. One thing this means is that in all of our interactions with the public, we need to use the same good social skills that we use in other areas of our life. So the same social skills we would use to try to get a job we really wanted, or a date we really wanted, or the same social warmth we would have when we're around our best friends. We need to use those same social skills when we're doing animal advocacy. Lastly, our choice of activity. Because there's so many ways that animals are used and abused and killed, there are of course many things we can do to try to combat that. There are all sorts of issues to work on, and even once we've picked an issue, there's all sorts of approaches and campaigns and tactics we can use to advance that issue. So how do each one of us choose the type of activity that we choose to spend our limited amount of time, money, and energy as animal advocates on? Do we choose activities that are fun or funny or entertaining? Do we choose to work on issues that are in the media right now? Do we choose to work on issues that our friends are working on? Do we choose to work on issues that we feel we have some special talent for? Do we choose to work on issues that have some personal meaning for us? For example, if I grew up with a dog that I really loved, maybe I choose to work on companion animal issues and preventing euthanasia. So do we choose our type of activity based on any one of these things? Or do we kind of take a step back mentally and think, of all the issues, of all the approaches, of all the things to do, what is actually going to do the most good for animals? Spare the most lives, reduce the greatest amount of suffering. All of us start off with the motivation of wanting to do good for animals, to be on their side, to do the right thing, to stand up for them. But we need to move beyond that. So our concern is not just doing good, but how can we do the most good for animals? If we think about the for-profit companies of the world, whether it's Coca-Cola, Adidas, whatever the company may be, they all have a bottom line. And that bottom line is making as much money as they can. And so every decision they make, what to buy, what to sell, who to sell it to, how to advertise it, every one of those decisions is made with an eye towards the bottom line. If it makes them more money, they do it. If it makes them less money, they don't do it. We animal advocates, we have a bottom line as well. Now, our bottom line, of course, is not making money, but I would submit to you our bottom line is two things. And that's saving the lives and reducing the suffering of as many animals as possible. Saving the lives and reducing the suffering of numerically as many animals as possible. If we truly believe that all animals are individuals whose life matters, whose pain matters, whose pleasure matters, if we truly believe that when it comes to their value and their worth and their right to be free of use and abuse and exploitation and killing, that a dog is the same as a chicken, as a horse, as a rabbit, as a cat, as a bunny, as a mouse, as a gerbil, as a whale, as a dolphin, as any other animal you may name. But we truly believe that each one of these animals, regardless of species, matters just as much as every other one. And I feel we have the ethical obligation to do the work that is going to help the greatest number of those individuals, regardless of which species they happen to be. And if we believe the same thing, the one implication of that is the value of focusing at least the majority of our time and money and energy on farm animal issues and on issues of diet change. There's so much good. There's certainly good work that could be done in all sorts of areas. In the U.S., those working on fur, on vivisection, companion animals, wild animals, animals in entertainment, they're all helping some animals. They're all reducing the number of animals being raised and killed in these industries each year. But if you add up all the good they're doing, they're only sparing about 1 million or so animals a year if you add up the good from all of those campaigns. On the other hand, the number of farm animals being spared a lifetime of misery as a result of diet change and those advocating diet change is not 1 million, but 500 million. There are 500 million fewer farm animals that will be raised and killed in the United States this year as a result of Americans changing diet habits, and therefore as a consequence of those advocating diet change, whether those are health advocates or animal advocates or environmental advocates or whomever. Those advocating diet change are sparing 500 million animals a year from a lifetime of misery. Now, those numbers are specific to the United States, but the same general trend holds true there in Australia and in every other Western country. And this is not because those working on diet change issues are smarter or harder working or anything like that. It's simply a function of the fact that because there are so many animals raised and killed for food, that right now and for the foreseeable future, an area where virtually every one of us can do the most good, spare the greatest number of individuals, reduce the greatest amount of animal suffering. The area where almost every one of us can do the most good is in working to protect farm animals and in encouraging people to change their diet in a more compassionate direction. It's bizarre that any one of us should have the ability to save the lives or spare the suffering of tens of thousands of animals. And yet the fact is that each one of us, every single one of us, does have that power. It may be hard to convince family or friends to change their diet. All of us have probably had bad experiences with at least some family members or friends. But the reality is if we spend just, say, 2 hours a week, most weeks for the next couple years, maybe 2 hours most Saturdays for the next couple years, doing smart, effective veg advocacy work, like college leafleting or like other things, we would create enough diet change to literally spare the misery, spare the lives of tens of thousands of individual farm animals. Individuals with just as much value and worth and intelligence as a dog or cat or other animal we may have waiting for us back at home. So if we think about next weekend and how you're going to spend your time next weekend, think about the next paycheck you get and how you're going to spend that. Is there any better use of that time and of that money than putting it towards helping the greatest number of animals, than putting it towards working to end the horrors that we all know are going on in farms across Australia this very minute? And the more we look to the research to guide the work that we're doing, and the more we adopt that bottom line mentality of what will work for changing behavior, what will work for sparing the greatest number of individuals, the more we adopt that bottom line mentality, we can become exponentially more effective, help exponentially more animals with the same amount of time and money and energy that we have to put towards animal advocacy. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much it that I have. For anyone that's interested in learning more about psychology and social change and what works and what doesn't, you can check out Change of Heart at www.changeofheartbook.com. That's changeofheartbook.com. And the new one, Veganomics, which looks at all the research specific to vegetarians and vegans, is similarly veganomicsbook.com, veganomicsbook.com. And so thank you all for the work that you're doing there in Australia. It's really fantastic. Thanks to the organizer of this event for putting it on and for having me. And so thank you very much for what you're doing, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.